Trump's personal envoy, Steve Witkoff, just got outed as a Russian agent. Just how does the president's inside man get turned by the Russians? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's break down this absolutely wild story. But before we do, of course, guys, if you want to support me and enable me to continue to make these sort of controversial but truthful videos, I need your support. You can imagine sponsors don't really want to touch me because I'm such a political channel, but that's okay because you guys cover my back at combatvetnews.com. Becoming a member gets you access to uncensored combat footage. Twice a week, we do breakdowns, we do Q&As. Any one of these tiers will get you access to the combat videos. But if you want access to the Q&As, that's Lieutenant tier and above. Thanks to the thousands of you guys that do support me. I appreciate it so much. And you can also become a member on YouTube. Okay, so buckle up for this one. The U.S. envoy, that's Trump's personally appointed buddy, literally got so flipped by the Russians that he is actually coaching them on how to get their peace plan implemented by President Trump, on how to manipulate the sitting U.S. president. Now, literally, according to a leaked transcript from Bloomberg, Steve Witkoff, it literally coaches Putin's personal envoy, Yuri Ushakov, in how to manipulate President Trump to ensure that the Russian position remains front and center in the president's mind. Now, when asked to comment on this transcript by Russian state media, Ushakov didn't question the recording's authenticity. He said simply that it wasn't Russia that leaked them. He said the calls had been leaked to, quote, hinder U.S.-Russia ties. So it's unlikely this is being done to improve relations. Again, this is classic Russian doublespeak. Instead of making clear statements of what is or isn't true, they simply make speculative statements, right? One might think that this was leaked to disrupt talks or some shit like that. Well, people could think anything. One might think it was leaked by aliens, right? That's not really relevant. Yushakov said he spoke with Witkoff by phone quite often and refused to discuss the specific content of the recording. He said the essence of these conversations is that they're confidential. I won't comment. No one should comment. Now, the White House also said that this transcript is absolutely true. And President Trump, when asked about it, said this is exactly what he expects his negotiators to do. Now, before we take a look about this, well, let's take a look at the transcript itself. Then we're going to talk about why I'm using the word agent to describe his relationship to Russia. Okay, so here's the full transcript from Bloomberg, right? Steve Witkoff, the phone rings. Steve Witkoff answers the phone. He says, hey, Yuri. Yuri says, Steve, how are you doing? Right? They make some nice introductions. Yuri, of course, glazing Steve Witkoff, saying, great job with that Gaza peace deal. And it's one of the things that, yeah, we talked about. It seems to have been a good job. It ended a bloody, pretty one-sided, civilian casualty-heavy conflict, but it ended it, and that's really important. So he glazes Steve over that, even though I strongly suspect that it was Jared Kushner who did the heaviest lifting, because, well, we'll see. Steve Witkoff says, listen, we just got to get this Russia-Ukraine thing solved and everybody will be jumping for joy. Yuri says, yeah, you got to solve just one problem, the Russia-Ukrainian war, right? And Steve Witkoff says, I know, how do we get that solved? Then Yuri doesn't answer the question. He answers a different question. He says, would it be useful if our bosses spoke on the phone, right? He says, sure. When do you think it would be possible? Steve Witkoff says, as soon as you want. My guy is ready to do it. And on one hand, I want to point out that if you know anything about negotiations, if somebody comes to you and says they want something, you should probably extract a concession. So a savvy diplomat might have said, hey, we're happy to have this phone call. The president, just as a show of good faith and to show you're serious, why don't you pause Shahed drone strikes for a 72-hour period? You don't need to tell us ahead of time, right? But once we see a 72-hour pause in Shahed drone strikes, then we can get this call in the books, right? That's what a savvy diplomat would do. Never give it up for free. Witkoff doesn't do this. He says, listen, Trump wants to do it. And sure, Trump loves doing these phone calls. Trump doesn't view them as being things to negotiate around. A phone call is nothing to Trump. So Witkoff says, sure, he's ready to do it. And on one hand, I don't think this is the smoking gun, though a savvy diplomat wouldn't do this. But Trump has a way of viewing things, and Steve Witkoff, if he were acting as Trump's agent, as Trump's envoy, this is something he would do, right? Trump expressed that he wants to make this conversation happen. Witkoff says, I'd love to make it happen. Sure. Now, here's where things get off the rails, right? Unprompted, by the way. Yuri only asks, do you think it's possible? Yuri doesn't ask, what should he say? How do we get this done? Instead, Steve Witkoff says, Yuri, here's what I would do, my recommendation. Yuri goes, go ahead. Witkoff proceeds to describe exactly how to manipulate Trump on the call. He says, listen, congratulate him on the Gaza peace deal. Say that you've supported it from the jump. You supported it. You respect that he's a man of peace and that you're really glad it happened. So I would tell him that, right? I think that it's going to be a really good call. He says, because let me tell you what I told the president. I told the president that the Russian Federation has always wanted a peace deal. That's my belief. Again, we've talked about the fact that Steve Witkoff doesn't really know that much about the Russians. There's been no evidence in terms of Russian actions that reflect a desire for a peace deal. The Russian actions have only been escalatory. They have increased their attacks on European and NATO allies. They have increased their incursions into NATO airspace. They have scaled up their targeting of Ukrainian infrastructure. There is no action they've taken that shows that they want a peace deal, right? But Steve Witkoff states his belief is otherwise. Again, a good diplomat doesn't live in the world of belief or vibes or feelings. They live in the world of actions and intentions. But that's fine, right? He says, I told the president I believe that. And I believe the question is, we have two nations having a hard time coming to a compromise. And when we do, we're going to have a peace deal. Okay, again, this is actually Steve Witkoff outing the fact he doesn't really know what he's talking about. A compromise between two nations at war is a peace deal. That's what it's called, right? Then he says, again, the naivete really coming out here. I'm even thinking we can maybe set out like a 20-point peace proposal, just like we did in Gaza. Put out a 20-point Trump plan together that was 20 points for peace, and I'm thinking we do the same thing with you. My point is this. Yuri cuts him off. I think our very leaders could be here to discuss, right? So here's what I want to point out. Steve Witkoff outing himself is incredibly naive, sure, by saying, well, maybe if it's 20 points, it'll work. This is not the core of it. It's like saying that, hey, instead of writing a memo, why don't we do a PowerPoint? The format isn't important, whether it's a 20-point memo or whatever. The important thing is the actual material, right? Whether you lay it out in a long treaty or a short bullet points or an interpretive dance, the mechanism of how it's presented isn't the core sticking issue. And the fact that Witkoff is like, wait, what if we say it's a 20-point plan? Guys, more bullet points doesn't make your plan more forceful. Does Steve Witkoff really not realize that? Holy shit, we should all be real estate investors if we can become multimillionaires with this level of naivete. Yuri says, that's a great point. Our leaders could discuss. Even Yuri's like, this is retarded. Steve, I agree with you that he will congratulate. He will say that Mr. Trump is a real peace man and so on and so on. And then he will say, and then Steve Witkoff continues, unprompted. He's like, here's what I think would be amazing. If you want to discuss that with my boss, come back to you. He says, listen, hear what I'm saying. Here's what I want you to say. Say this to President Putin, right? Say to Putin, hey, tell Trump that Steve and Yuri discussed a very similar 20-point plan to peace and that that could be something we think could move the needle a little bit. We're open to these sorts of things to explore what it's going to take to get peace done. Again, all this implies that Steve Witkoff doesn't even have a sense of the sticking issue, right? This is crazy, right? Like there's usually a core issue at work and he doesn't even seem to be able to identify what that is. Sorry, I keep getting distracted. This isn't even the main point. It's just he's so dumb, right? Now, what's it going to take to get a peace deal done? Donetsk and maybe a land swap somewhere. But what I'm saying, instead of talking like that, let's talk more hopefully because I think we're going to get a deal here. I think Yuri, the president, will give me a lot of space and discretion to get to a deal. Yuri continues, I see. So if we can create an opportunity after that, I talked to Yuri and had a conversation that I think could lead to big stuff. Yuri says, okay, sounds good. Here's one more thing. Steve Witkoff says, Zelensky's coming to the White House on Friday. Yuri says, I know. Witkoff goes, I will go to that meeting because they want me there. But I think if possible, we have the call with your boss before that Friday meeting. Yuri goes, before? Yeah? Steve Witkoff goes, correct. So I got your advice, Yuri says. I will discuss that with my boss and come back to you. Okay. Now, this is the two key takeaways here is the times in which Yuri tells the Russians how to manipulate the U.S. president. One, it happens here where he says, listen, you need to call your boss before he meets with Zelensky, right? saying, listen, if you want to manipulate him, if you want to have your position pushed harder, you have to take these actions, right? Second, Witkoff explains, hey, here is how to frame your conversation with Trump to make it the most productive possible, to get Trump on your good side. Okay. This is the framing I want you guys to take. And this is why I use the word Russian agent. Okay. You and I in regular life, we have people who we hire to be our agents. An agent, just like an AI agent, is someone whose job it is, and oftentimes is legally required to advocate for you and your interests, right? So an example might be a lawyer. Let's say you're accused of a crime. You hire a lawyer. That lawyer, imagine if they had these type of conversations with the prosecutor's office, in which the prosecutor's office said, listen, we really want this guy to take this 20-year plea deal. And you'd want your lawyer to go, my client's not going to do a plea deal. He's innocent. Or my client is only going to do 10 years max. He's never going to bite on a 20-year plea deal. And instead, your lawyer goes, okay, well, if you tell him that you've got him dead to rights, and you tell him that the last guy who did this crime did 40, I think you can manipulate him to do a plea deal. Do you feel like that's your lawyer going to bat for you? No. Instead of trying to advocate for your interests, he's trying to advocate for the prosecutor's interests. And so is he acting as your agent? No, he's acting as an agent of the prosecutor. You would be offended. Similarly, a real estate agent representing you, the buyer. That is another example. Steve Witkoff knows this, by the way. He knows what a real estate agent is, okay? This is an analogy even he would understand. Imagine Steve Witkoff hires a real estate agent. He says, listen, I want to buy a condo for my kid. I'm hiring you, a real estate agent. I want you to go get me the best deal possible. Real estate agent sits down, finds a condo, talks to the other real estate agent, the seller, and goes, listen, seller, Steve says he only wants to pay, listen, you want to get Steve to pay top dollar for this? Here's what you're going to do. You're going to call him. You're going to give him a sob story. You're going to say this and this and this, and then he's going to pay top dollar for this condo. If you are Steve Witkoff, he would know. He'd be furious with that agent. He goes, no, you're my real estate agent. You're my agent. You get me the best deal possible, right? Again, imagine if that agent was to discuss how to manipulate you and then not discuss that with you yourself, right? Imagine if that real estate agent went back and you go, how'd that meeting go? And he goes, oh, they're pretty tough bargain. It's a pretty tough condo. It's a high market, blah, 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 blah. Well, you'd go, hey, man, that's not, you gave insider information, insider insight to the opposite party. You didn't work for me. You worked for that opposite party. You manipulated me. You hid information from me. Do you see how an agent should be at their most transparent and their most forthright with you, the principal, and should be not providing this kind of insight to your negotiating adversary? This is why this is so offensive. This is why people talk about, oh, Steve Witkoff violates diplomatic protocol. By the way, I want to point out, Steve Witkoff is not the special envoy to Russia. There is an ambassador to Russia, and it's not Steve. And what's fascinating is, again, that Witkoff, first off, is the de facto envoy to Vladimir Putin, essentially because Putin selected him. Remember, the original, his title is actually official peace envoy, U.S. special envoy for peace missions. But Steve Witkoff has never, not once, met with the Ukrainians. Not one time. Think about that. His goal, he's the peace envoy, but he only meets with the Russians. And by the way, the original Trump-Ukraine war envoy, Keith Kellogg, Vladimir Putin kicked him out. Vladimir Putin said, I'm not going to meet with this guy. Why? Probably because Keith Kellogg was a former general. He shows up, again, he doesn't show up with a career diplomat's level of sophistication, but he shows up with a military background that involved high-level international agreements, relationships, diplomacy, right? Keith Kellogg had a, high school varsity level of diplomatic wherewithal. And that was a problem for Vladimir Putin, because Vladimir Putin is one of the best in the world at diplomacy, at manipulation, at geopolitics, okay? I'm trying to, this is like playing LeBron, okay? If you're going to take on LeBron, right, a person who played high school basketball actually probably knows enough to know how intimidating it is to play LeBron. But let's say you were to recruit a Mongolian goat farmer who's never heard of basketball and never heard of LeBron. You were to explain the rules of, they say, this is the rules of basketball, and you were to tell him, okay, you're going to play this guy LeBron James. He would go, well, you'd say LeBron is really good. I think he's one of the best in the world at this game. And the Mongolian would go, oh, wow, he's pretty good. Cool. I can't wait for our match. Like, if you don't know, it's the Dunning-Kruger. There's a level of ignorance that is a strategic advantage, right? There's actually a level of knowledge that becomes not a strategic disadvantage, but there's a level of knowledge that at some point you know enough to be able to understand the situation you're in. But there's a level of ignorance below just being bad at something and not even being able to grade whether you're doing a good or bad job. And this conversation reveals that Steve Witkoff is at the Mongolian farmer level of ignorance, right? It's not a basketball player who doesn't know strategies, but who knows when they're outclassed. This is a Mongolian goat farmer who really doesn't understand whether or not he's being outclassed. That's the reason why they sidelined Kellogg, is because Kellogg knew enough to know he was in over his head. And the thing with diplomacy, what you have on your side is that you can have the biggest team you want. And so if I'm going to take on LeBron, if they're like, you have to take on LeBron, I'd say, listen, great. I want to get all the other goated people on my team. Basically, if I have to do it, I want the other, I don't know how many people play basketball, but I want the other 4 or 5 players on the court to be top 5 NBA players. I want them to be, whoever won the championship this year. All right. I want 4 of those guys together, perfectly synergized, perfectly together. Right. I want the best in the world in my corner. And Steve Witkoff doesn't even know enough to do that. That's something that Keith Kellogg definitely knew. As naive as I found his plan, it was so much better than this. And again, the fact that Steve Witkoff doesn't even know enough to know that he is being, I don't know if he knows he's being Trump's agent or not. Like, I don't know if he knows that he's supposed to be like the real estate agent for the White House, the lawyer for the White House, right? Like, an ambassador represents the interests of the United States, just like a lawyer has to represent your interests, not collaborate with the prosecutor or the opposing party. Anyway, guys, hit subscribe. Thanks to all of our Lieutenant tier members. We couldn't do it without you guys. And, of course, our Combat Vet News Colonel tier members, Alfred Chesky, Alan Nuts, and Christine Schumann, Dan M., Deborah Oppenheimer. Cheers.